Russia spends astronomical amounts of money on its imperialistic war in Ukraine. One could certainly claim that Putin launched an arms race 2.0, which will decide the fate of the European continent. However, will Russia be able to maintain the pace of the spending? The critical question that observers have is whether military spending destroys Russia like its predecessor, the Soviet Union. It is widely acknowledged that the collapse of the Soviet Union was partly due to its high defense spending. Military spending increased during Reagan's presidency, particularly under initiatives like the Strategic Defense Initiative. The budgets had been rising since the early 1970s. However, specific numbers were hard to find because different government ministries reported them in unclear ways. Estimates indicated that military spending took up to 10 to 20% of the GDP. However, it was clear that the military required a lot of money, even when the economy was struggling. This focus on the military also pulled necessary talent away from potential economic reforms under Gorbachev. Instead of driving needed market changes, innovators and entrepreneurs were directed into defense. In 1982, Leonid Brezhnev gave a fiery speech about the arms race against the US. Quote, "Lagging behind in this competition is inadmissible. We expect our scientists, designers, engineers and technicians to do everything possible to successfully resolve all tasks connected with this. The country will spare nothing to keep the armed forces up to mark and give them the most advanced weapons and military hardware." End of quote. However, the Soviet military budget was one of the most tightly guarded secrets of the Soviet Union. One can only imagine how far the Soviet Union's propaganda went to hide the real number. As the country was seemingly becoming more transparent, the world could have a better understanding of how much the Soviets spent on defense, or defense because it was really offense, for offensive means. In 1989, the Soviet Union unveiled one of its most closely held secrets, the actual size of its military budget, which had long been the subject of speculation among Western analysts. Newly uncovered documents from the Hoover archives highlight the internal conflict among the Soviet leaders regarding whether maintaining secrecy was beneficial for national interests or detrimental to their credibility. Officially, it was claimed that the 1980 defense budget accounted for less than 3% of the country's GDP, a figure intended to provide reassurance, yet seen as absurdly low for both home and abroad. Estimates of the budget varied dramatically. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute estimated it at 48.7 billion rubles, almost 3 times the official claim. The Defense Intelligence Agency suggested it could be as high as 107 billion rubles. Only a select few individuals were aware of the actual budget. Reports indicate that perhaps only 2 or 4 people might have known, potentially including Gorbachev, the General Secretary, the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, and the Chief of General Staff. Some even argued that no one truly grasped the complete extent of defense spending. In 1986, Gorbachev aimed to portray the USSR as assertive yet non-aggressive. Still, the suspiciously low officially published budget damaged his credibility, especially in the light of the secrecy surrounding the Chernobyl incident. In response, a resolution by the Central Committee called for increased military transparency, leading to the creation of the Politburo Task Force. Detractors, like Marshal Akromeyev, contended that disclosing the real numbers could unmask a bluff, erode confidence, complicate arms sales and necessitate uncomfortable economic comparisons. Well, in reality, by the middle of the 80s, the Soviet Union economy and military was in such a low point, so much eroded, they couldn't risk letting the West know how low they have actually eroded to. Later proposals aimed to present a credible figure that encompassed the 20 billion rubles and could be compared to the Western defense spending in per capita terms or as GDP percentage. After some delays, Gorbachev announced a revised defense budget of 77.3 billion rubles in 1989, which was then reduced to 71 billion in 1990. However, doubts persisted. CIA analysts projected that the actual expenditure might range between 130 and 160 billion rubles, indicating that the figures released were more of a best effort rather than a complete representation. In comparison, the US military budget share today accounts for a mere 3.4% of the GDP. For historic context, in the 1980s, each superpower spent about 300 billion US dollars a year on military efforts. This represents about 6.7% of the US gross national product and over 15% for the USSR. Needless to say, the militarization on that caliber heavily affected the Soviet economy. The emphasis on military production led to various economic consequences. Firstly, it caused imbalances in how resources were distributed throughout the economy. Major industries shifted their focus to manufacturing military equipment. In the best case, Soviet traditions neglect the production of consumer goods. This shift resulted in ongoing shortages and growing dissatisfaction among the population. The government prioritized the creation of tanks, aircraft, and weaponry, driven by its ideological goal of establishing the USSR as a global superpower. Moreover, the financial burden of maintaining a military-industrial complex placed significant stress on the Soviet economy, especially during the times of economic stagnation. A large fraction of the Soviet GDP was devoted to military spending, which posed difficulties in meeting civilian demands. This highlighted a fundamental contradiction in the Soviet economic system. Urban areas frequently experienced shortages, leading to public dissatisfaction and the emergence of consumer-driven black market. Does all of that sound familiar to you? Well, all of that is happening right now in Russia under Vladimir Putin, especially in the last 3 years. This is the arms race 2.0. Today, the Russian Federation, under its unchangeable ruler Vladimir Putin, does the same thing. Russia, since 2014, has been increasing its military spending like crazy. In 2000, the Russian army's spending was very modest, only 9 billion US dollars. However, as time passed by, Putin got acclimated to Russian politics. He subdued the media and persecuted the opposition. Unchallenged, he began increasing military spending. By 2014, the number skyrocketed to 84 billion US dollars, almost 10 times in 14 years. After February 2022, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, military spending skyrocketed again. Russia plans to allocate 13.2 trillion rubles or $167.9 billion for military efforts and 3.45 trillion rubles or $43.9 billion for internal security this year. As you might have already guessed, this is not the ceiling yet. A senator from Russia's Federation Council has proposed significant federal spending cuts to increase the funding for the war in Ukraine and national security. I will translate for human tongue. This means a senator, leading Russian official, proposes, let's take money from the civilian areas and civilians and pour it into the military-industrial complex. They have a direct experience with it in the 80s and 70s. Even early 90s, they lost the arms race and now they want to do it again. They're going to lose again. Anatoly Artamonov, chairman of the Budget and Financial Markets Committee, suggested reallocating up to 2 trillion rubles annually for military expenses, which already comprise 40% of the national budget, the highest since the Soviet era. The cuts, expected through 2028, would target inefficient expenditures, such as certain subsidies and funding for non-core assets like football clubs. Militarization of today's Russia has been a long process. The collapse of the Soviet Union left Russia politically and economically unstable. But Moscow did not see itself as defeated. Instead, it viewed Gorbachev's Soviet era as a period of betrayal, particularly regarding NATO expansion and the unfulfilled promises of Western economic integration. This especially touches my country and the Baltics in general, because Russians view Gorbachev-era glasnost and perestroika as a mistake, and NATO's expansion eastwards to Estonia, to my country, as a mistake also, although it was our free will which caused it. These perceptions shaped Russian security policies and drove the modernization of its armed forces, which had been severely degraded during the 1990s. While modernization involved acquiring new capabilities, it often focused on upgrading legacy systems or implementing programs conceived decades earlier. In the 1990s, Russian conventional forces struggled with funding, personnel reductions, and equipment obsolescence. However, nuclear forces remained relatively well funded to maintain strategic deterrence. Land-based missile systems were modernized, and novel systems such as nuclear-powered cruise missiles and hypersonic glide vehicles began development. The ground forces were restructured, with high readiness units and special forces gaining prominence. Equipment modernization included upgraded tanks, artillery, missiles, and UAVs, enhancing operational precision. The Navy and the airspace forces, though, faced mixed outcomes. The Navy retained a modest power projection capability, emphasizing defense and submarine-based deterrence. The most famous of this example would be Admiral Kuznetsov, the Russian one and only aircraft carrier, which is a total senior under repairs for the last forever. Almost 50 years of its service, the majority of it has spent in dry dock under repairs, and as soon as it gets back on water, something happens and it got to go back home again. The airspace forces benefited from investment in multi-role aircraft, modernized bombers, and the introduction of digital command and control systems. The 2008 New Look reforms, backed by political leadership and adequate funding, reorganized command structures. It emphasized professionalization and laid the groundwork for joint networked operations. By the 2010s, Moscow possessed a more professional, technologically advanced, and operationally capable military, enabling it to project power regionally and globally, even as economic constraints continue to shape the pace and scope of the modernization. However, the military industry, despite crazy funding, has serious problems. Russia's military-industrial complex, or the OPK, is struggling due to international sanctions and ongoing war demands. Even with high military spending, the OPK has difficulty producing new and advanced systems. It primarily uses old Soviet designs, makes limited upgrades, and relies on outside suppliers for essential parts. Efforts to produce everything domestically have failed, leading to simpler products, lower quality, and stagnation in research and development. While the Russian OPK can produce enough to support its war in Ukraine for now, it cannot keep up with the advanced technologies from the Western countries or China. Since the sanctions started in 2014 and the invasion of 2022, the OPK has not significantly improved its technology, although it has adapted to meet current needs. The quality of equipment has declined, and the high-quality machinery has been replaced with lower-quality versions. The focus has shifted to refurbishing old Soviet equipment and making simpler systems that are easier to produce. Key challenges for the OPK include stretched production chains, a lack of skilled workers, and limited innovation in advanced technologies. Despite these issues, Russia can still maintain basic military and scientific capabilities to supply weapons and modernize its equipment through initiatives like the 2025 to 2034 State Armament Program. Imports from countries like China, Iran, and North Korea are still essential, showing Russia's ongoing dependence on foreign suppliers. Western sanctions play a crucial role in weakening the OPK, in the short term by limiting Russia's ability to fight, and in the long term by reducing its capacity to compete with NATO and China. Key measures include stricter export controls, closing channels for evading sanctions, and encouraging skilled workers and innovators to leave. While Russia may keep spending heavily on defense in the near term, any easing of sanctions could speed up military modernization, allowing the Kremlin to buy more while reducing losses in battle. In the end, the OPK is likely to stagnate or decline, producing only basic systems that cannot compete with more advanced opponents. By targeting Russia's military and civilian-linked sectors, the West can make it harder for Russia to compete in the long run. limiting its ability to challenge Western and NATO forces while still allowing for low-intensity conflicts. As in a classic Soviet story, Russia's military spending today is full of lies. In June, Putin announced plans to reduce military expenditure over the next 3 years amid warnings of a looming recession. This follows comments from officials like Economic Development Minister Maxim Reshetnikov, indicating that wartime economic growth is slowing as resources dwindle. Despite projected 4.3% GDP growth in 2024, high inflation continues due to sanctions. Wage growth has reached a 16-year high due to labor shortages caused by military enlistment. The Higher School of Economics predicts a deficit of 2.6 million workers by the end of 2024, prompting the Kremlin to offer incentives to attract recruits. While state defense spending has supported the military-industrial complex, private industries struggle with rising costs and debt, raising concerns about potential banking crisis. Additionally, reintegrating nearly 140,000 returning soldiers poses further economic challenges. Putin questioned the validity of economic decline reports and criticized NATO's spending priorities. He mentioned that the planned reduction in defense spending is a measured response to economic pressures while attempting to maintain military readiness. In 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev revealed the Soviet Union's military budget for the first time. He disclosed $119 billion in defense spending, much higher than previous figures. He planned to cut his budget by 14% over 2 years, reallocating over $16 billion to improve living standards, such as consumer goods and welfare, citing reduced international tensions and arms control as justifications. While Gorbachev aimed to enhance legislative oversight through the Congress of People's Deputies, Western analysts were skeptical, believing the actual spending was underreported. So why should we believe Putin now? He has only been increasing the military budget and lying about Russia's imperialist intentions. Russia plans to spend about $1.1 trillion on building up its military over the next 11 years to prepare for a possible large-scale war. And yes, I did not make a mistake here, $1.1 trillion. Kirilo Budanov, Ukraine's military intelligence chief, said this is the most ambitious weapons program Russia launched since the Soviet Union ended. The country is fully modernizing its politics, economy, and society to support this military buildup. To aid this effort, Russia has created 2 new military districts, Moscow and Leningrad, and plans to form more divisions and military units. Budanov noted that Russia is not only looking to dominate the region, but also to change the global order. He also warned that Russia is using hybrid warfare tactics abroad, such as cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns aimed at weakening democracies. As Western intelligence warns about Russia's military strength, Budanov mentioned that Germany's intelligence chief pointed out the possibility of attacks on NATO by 2030. Despite what Putin and Russian propagandists say about Russia's might, we already see severe effects on Russia's economy. At the June St. Petersburg Economic Forum, Russia's finance minister, economy minister, and central bank governor discussed the country's economic future amid rising fears of a recession. Economy Minister Maxim Reshetnikov admitted that Russia is likely facing a downturn. This situation is a result of a focus on military spending rather than economic growth. Even though higher commodity prices and support from countries like China, Turkey, and the UAE provided some short-term relief, Russia's economy still struggles. Why? Because of sanctions, global isolation, and prioritizing military production over necessary economic changes. Since February 2022, Russia's economy initially shrank but then grew again due to good trade conditions and increased investment financed by credit. The GDP grew by 4.1% in both 23 and 24. As we already know, it is mainly driven by the military-industrial complex and war-related payments. However, by mid-23, signs of an overheated economy appeared with record low unemployment, rising wages and inflation. This situation led the Bank of Russia to raise the interest rates to 21%. It mainly affected non-military sectors, while the defense sector remained largely unaffected. By early 25, economic growth sharply slowed, with a 0.6% contraction in the first quarter, driven by weak activity in mining, trade, real estate and leisure sectors. High interest rates, labor shortages, supply chain problems and falling oil prices contributed to this slowdown. In April and May 25, Russia faced a critical economic crisis. A federal budget deficit surpassed liquid reserves due to rising military spending and a 12% decline in oil revenues. Federal expenditures reached 16 trillion rubles, prompting a deficit revision to 3.79 trillion rubles. GDP growth is forecasted to slow significantly, with inflation above 10%, limiting interest rate cuts. Domestic borrowing is constrained. This economic strain impacts military efforts, with stagnating industrial output and recruitment challenges. The 2026 federal budget discussions will reveal priorities between military spending and economic stability. By May 2025, Russia faced a federal budget deficit of 3.4 trillion rubles. This has nearly depleted the National Welfare Fund's liquid assets and forced the government to rely on domestic borrowing. In conclusion, Russia has been spending colossal funds on its military. The economic decline is undeniable, as the economic growth is entirely driven by the military industry. However, just like the Soviet Union, Russia won't be able to lie its way out of its destiny. My friends, thank you for watching this analysis. If you like it, become a member of the channel, because these videos, in-depth analysis videos, are always accessible to members before anybody else, 1 to 2 weeks before. So sign up for channel membership here on YouTube. Very cheap. Until my next video, my friends, Slava Ukraini and bye-bye.